In retrospect, Superstar was very successful, so people think it must have been a flash of genius. It wasn't at all. It was something that kind of grew by chance, really. When I was 15, at public boarding school in England, at a very church-centred school with a lot of divinity and scripture and religious instruction, I was always very intrigued by the role of Judas Iscariot, rather an unlucky chap. He happened to be around at the time, and I thought, well, I think most people in that situation would have maybe acted as he did. I thought if I were a writer or if I were a painter or a sculptor, which I'm not, that would be a very good topic, Judas Iscariot. The idea of the story of Jesus from Judas's point of view intrigued me from a very early age, even before I met Andrew. I met Andrew in 1965 when he was 17 and I was 19, I think. I was hanging around the pop world, trying, believe it or not, to be a pop singer. Don't laugh. And I was hawking around a tape of my songs to show off my voice. And I'd recorded this tape in a little studio for a £5. And to my amazement, one of the songs got recorded by a group. To actually get somebody to make a record of what you'd written was quite an achievement. And although my record was a flop, the fact that I had a 45 RPM single with my name on it, under the song title, that was something. I felt I was on the first step of the ladder. So I kind of began saying, well, I'm really a songwriter now. And I was hawking my one song around. And in the process of doing that, I came across an agent named Desmond Elliott. I was also trying to flog him a book idea, which he didn't like either. And he didn't like the record, he didn't like my book idea, but he did say, I'm looking after a young guy called Andrew Lloyd Webber. And I thought, with a name like that, he's got to change it. You know, he'll never make it with that name. But I was introduced to this bloke, Andrew, and as soon as I met Andrew, I knew that he was quite a special person. He was somebody who was almost certainly going to be a success. And Andrew's burning ambition then, as now, I guess, was to write for the theatre. I think it was the combination of his enthusiasm for the theatre and my obsession with rock and roll that gave us a slightly, I mean, the mixture worked rather well. Although I was aware of theatre and he was aware of rock and roll, so it wasn't like we were complete opposites. It was a very different world from rock. Nobody had brought rock into the theatre. And all these things we did slightly by accident, but I think that was why we worked, because we were doing something different, which is a golden rule for success. Got to be good, but you've got to be different as well. We'd had a minor success, not commercially, but artistically, with a piece we'd done for children called Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, which at that point was very successful in schools in England. So we were aware that we could write entertainingly about religious stories. I guess in 1968-69 we were looking for topics, and we'd even thought about something based on King David. But then I said, well, what about Judas Iscariot? And somehow that clicked with Andrew as well. And bit by bit, we put this musical together. We tried to sell this through our agent as a show. We wanted to write it as a show. We didn't want to write it as a record, because we were theatre animals, or so we thought. And nobody was interested. They said, oh, religion, forget it. The kids are not interested. Terrible idea. And the only people who showed any interest in it at all were MCA Records, or one man in particular, really, a chap called Brown Brolly, who thought, this is an interesting idea. And almost out of desperation, as a last resort, we had the idea that maybe we should do it on record first, and the record might do well enough to get us the show. And Brown Brolly said, well, you can make a single, which is why we did Superstar first. And if the single does well, then you can do the album. Because the album that we had in mind was quite an expensive album. We hadn't written the whole piece at this point, but just the main songs. And doing it on record, because no theatre wanted us, was the best thing we could have done, because it changed the whole nature of the work. I believe if some theatrical producer had said, yes, let's go for this story, let's do it out of town, I think the piece would have been, I mean, it wouldn't have been a hit. Once the initial song that we wrote, Jesus Christ, who are you, what have you sacrificed, that was the original chorus and nothing else. I suddenly got the idea that the word superstar, which was just coming into vogue, I wish I'd invented the word, but I didn't. But it was just a sort of hot new buzzword, which, thank God, has survived. Some, words sometimes come in and they're very big and meaningful for 4 weeks, and then, of course, you stick them into your work, and then, the work comes out and already it's out of date. But the line, Jesus Christ Superstar, fitted the tune so well. And then everybody said, wow, that's the title of the show. And I think the title of the show, which may have indicated to some people that we were trying to make him into a rock star, was one of the most significant reasons for its success, because it was a title in 1969 that made you think, bloody hell, I've got to see this or hear this. People were a bit unsure as to how it could be promoted. They were worried about what rack it would go into in the shops. And it was technically, or it is technically, an opera in that there is no spoken dialogue. And it is rock music, there's no doubt about that. And we called it a rock opera, a term that had been used by Pete Townsend for Tommy. And we thought, well, ours is a rock opera as well, but we're slightly different from The Who, but it's still a rock opera. The age of rock operas was Tommy and Superstar, full stop. So consequently, it's a little bit of a derided term now. But I would say it's a rock opera because it is rock and because it's an opera. You could call it a place of, if you want, you can call it a plate of egg and chips. It's still the same thing. I don't think I saw Superstar as a religious or political story. I saw it as a human story. And it was really Jesus as a man we were interested in. We wanted to portray Jesus as a human being who had doubts, as he does in the Bible, particularly in the Garden of Gethsemane, who was not always a nice guy. Sometimes he would lose his temper. It's all there in the Gospels. We wanted to bring out the human side of him without making a statement one way or the other, re his divinity. Superstar doesn't say Jesus was God. It certainly doesn't say he wasn't. It is Jesus seen through the eyes of Judas, and Judas didn't believe he was God. Or at least, I believe Judas didn't believe he was God. And I think that's why Judas felt he had to turn him in, because he felt that he was an ordinary man, a man who he, Judas, had admired, was now getting out of control. I think we were aware that anybody who had fundamentalist, rather extreme, in my opinion, views of Jesus as God might be offended. But as we kept stressing in endless interviews at the time, we do not say he wasn't God. It's up to you. We're just telling the story from the point of view of Judas Iscariot. And although we knew we would upset some people, we didn't trim it to make sure we pleased everybody, because you can't please everybody. And, there were a few people who said we were anti-Semitic, which really staggered me. Maybe I was, again, being very naive, but never crossed my mind for one moment that anybody who saw Superstar or even read the Bible could think that by having a bad Jew, Caiaphas, and a good Jew, Jesus, and lots of Jewish people from all different types of character, all different backgrounds, and Romans, that it could be anti-Semitic. It's a great Jewish story about a phenomenally great Jewish leader. Anti-Semitic? Balmy. Teddy was wonderful. He just looked the part. He had a beautiful voice. My favourite scene in the film, I think, is Gethsemane, when it's Teddy sort of on his own. It's beautifully shot, beautifully directed, wonderfully sung. He was magnificent. I don't think I'd heard of him before. I'm trying to remember now, it's a long time ago. He had subsequently done the show live so often. He may have done the show live in a concert before the film, but I don't think I was aware of him. But when Norman said, we got this great guy, and he was great, there was really no competition. We didn't have a great girl to sing Mary Magdalene. And then one night, Andrew went down, I believe, to see a possible Pontius Pilate, which we still hadn't got a pilot either. And the warm-up act in this club was this unknown girl called Yvonne Elliman. And Andrew ran me up in a state of great excitement, saying, you must come down, I've just been to this club and this fantastic girl singer. I found our Mary Magdalene, he said, very dramatically. We said, would you come around the next day and sing around the piano and sing this song we've written? When Yvonne sang the song beautifully, and we said, well, we'd like you to sing on the record. Well, you've got to have £100. The agent said, you must have £100. We were trying to give people royalties because we hadn't got any money. And we had to give Yvonne £100. No royalty, £100. Wrong. But she was wonderful. In the end, we did give Yvonne a royalty out of the generosity of our hearts. Well, there was no intention on our part to have any racial definitions or rules about who played what. When Judas was cast initially on Broadway, Ben Vereen got the role surprisingly ahead of Carl Anderson, who had played it in concert before Broadway. And we were slightly surprised that Tom O'Horgan, the director of the Broadway show, preferred Ben. I mean, Ben was great, but we all thought Carl was a shoo-in. But Carl did get the film. And Judas has been played over the years by hundreds of white guys, hundreds of black guys, hundreds of, whatever guys. And it just happened that on Broadway, Ben Vereen was the first Judas, and in the film, Carl Anderson. And neither were our choices. They were the choices of the directors. And I guess they were just the best guys for the part. Inevitably, at times, we had people saying, well, this is making some terrible statement. But of course, it wasn't. But I think Carl, he was a great performer, and it was very, very sad when he died so young. We worked on the film, but to be honest, we weren't really a major part of the mix. I was asked to do a screenplay. I thought, great, fantastic. So I after all, the screenplay already existed in that the lyrics were all there and the story was there. So really it was a question of, do I bring the Roman centurions in from the left or the right, or how many camels in this scene? That was what I felt had to happen. And I wrote a screenplay rather like Ben-Hur. Jesus addresses 20,000 people, or armies of Romans steam in from the left. And I think they took one look at that and thought, no, that's going to be $50 million, forget it. And my screenplay was instantly ditched, and Melvyn Bragg, Lord Bragg, came in and wrote a screenplay. And they had this concept, which I think was interesting, of a group of young players doing it in the desert, doing a version of Superstar in modern times, which was then 1973. Norman was great. He was really wanted us to be involved. We had lots of meetings with him. I liked him a lot. But I think there comes a point when when it's not right to interfere. There wasn't much we could do. Norman and his team had got their way of doing it. It was working well. For us to come in and say, look, can you make Mary sing this line here? That would not have been a good move. There was nothing we could have done that would have materially affected their vision, and nothing we really wanted to do. I had one or two worries about it at the time, only because it wasn't how I'd imagined it. But looking back on it, and I just see it's a very interesting original take by Norman Jewison and Melvyn Bragg. And we were incredibly lucky to get such an important director to make a beautiful film of our first major work. I think the reason why Superstar has lasted and is still performed, I'm going to Estonia next week to see Superstar in Estonian. I can't wait. The work has just gone all over the world and is still being performed literally hundreds of times a year. And the reason is because of the story. It's a great story. I think the prime duty of anybody writing a play or a book or making a film or whatever is to tell a great story and to make the characters truthful. Because then people identify with them, and that's the key. People can read what they want into it on top of the basic story, which is something that is universal to so many countries. In America, it's looked back on with some affection by people primarily younger than us. They say, gosh, that record, that got me through high school. And it was amazing for me to hear that for the first time, really, in the 90s. In England, Superstar is much more perceived as a great show. In America, it's perceived, and I didn't realize this, to this day as a fantastic album. If you made a list of 20 musicals in the 20th century, I think Superstar would have a good claim to be there. And I still get a lot of mail about Superstar, mainly polite, and I'm very grateful for it.